our keynote off now. The keynote is entitled Strengthening the Life Sciences Ecosystem to Enhance Clinical Trial Capacity. And we're very, very privileged to have Ritu Banerjee, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Office of Life Sciences and Biomanufacturing, Readiness, Innovation, Science and Economic Development with the Government of Canada, here with us today. Ritu holds a senior role that involves overseeing key strategic initiatives and policy development to support Canada's innovation agenda and economic growth. Today, she will be speaking with us about initiatives that are designed to improve the capacity for innovative trials in Canada and foster an ecosystem where clinical research can rapidly respond to emerging health challenges, all with the overall goal of making Canada a leader in life sciences and innovation. Following her presentation, Ritu will also be taking questions from the audience, and she's graciously agreed to be with us for most of the day. So again, I hope you'll have an opportunity to meet with her. And please stand up and prepare your questions as Ritu outlines the growth strategy for Canada.
You can hear me? Perfect, thank you. So thank you very much, merci beaucoup. J'apprécie, je suis très heureux d'être ici avec vous, and I really appreciate the invitation to have this opportunity to speak with you. It's been a few years since I've been back to Montreal. This is my hometown, so I always like coming here. So as Anne-Marie said, I'm going to be stepping back a bit and not focusing entirely on clinical trials, but talking about the broader ecosystem. And I'll start by discussing the strategy that the government has put in place, and then a recent announcement that our minister, the Minister Champagne, has made around the launch of Health Emergency Readiness Canada, and then I'll link it back to how it helps, hopefully helps, the clinical trial landscape. And I know my colleagues from Health Canada and CIHR are here, and they'll be speaking at length in terms of the deeper infrastructure and what's going on in the clinical trial landscape at the federal level. So I'm not going to steal their thunder. So to start the story, I have to go back to the pandemic in 2021, because just to kind of indicate just how difficult things were, and I guess the rude awakening, at least at the government level, that by not having sufficient infrastructure to deal with vaccine production and any kind of manufacturing base in Canada, we were definitely many steps behind where we should have been. And so that has colored and I think shaped where we would like to go moving forward. There were a lot of challenges at stake, but one of the things that came out of it, hopefully a positive thing, was the Biomanufacturing and Life Sciences Strategy, which was launched in 2021. And it has 5 basic, very key pillars, and I'll just go through them briefly, highlighting some of the points that I think may be relevant to you. The first point is about growing the sector, generally speaking. There hadn't been a lot of attention for many, many years, and this was an opportunity for the government to invest a significant amount of money, over $2 billion, in close to 40 projects, plus other things, which I'll elaborate, to revive the sector and attract business. And as Barry mentioned, without that, it becomes harder to do innovative clinical trials and research. So that was a key point, and part of that included, we have a facility, the Moderna facility, which is being set up in Laval. So again, it was focused heavily on vaccine production, but as I'll explain, our approach has been to really diversify the ecosystem and also diversify different platforms, because we don't know where and how the requirements will be in the future. That's one example, and we've also invested in Sanofi, which is out in Toronto, to again enhance their vaccine manufacturing base. In addition, we've also supported very innovative technologies out in BC, for example, Accelera and Aspect Biosystems. So it's definitely a range, but it's just to illustrate that the investments are there, and they've been done in great collaboration with our provincial counterparts. So that's growing the sector. The second part is around making sure that there are government assets that can be used during peacetime, but also deployed in the times of crisis to support the broader ecosystem. So the National Research Council, which is part of the industry portfolio, has invested heavily in the clinical trial material facility, which is here in Montreal, as well as the Biologics Manufacturing Center, which is also in Montreal. They're both in the Royalmount campus, not far from here. And both of them are there for doing ongoing work, research. So the Biologics Manufacturing Center, for example, does full finish capacity. So now we actually, in times of need, can actually have that capacity to do it in Canada, and that was an important consideration, making sure we had manufacturing bases in Canada that could be used. And similarly, the clinical trials material facility focuses on small batch cell biologics. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to get into all the details, but my colleagues can explain that in further detail later on, or I can provide that information. But all that to say that capacity has now come on board earlier this year, which we didn't really have for a long time. So that's more on the government side. Research and talent. We have invested heavily in 5 academic research hubs across Canada that are focusing on infectious disease, primarily influenza and pandemic preparedness. But the idea is to create that network, create that infrastructure at the academic and research level, again, to build that base and foundation. Because the life sciences ecosystem, unlike other areas of industrial development perhaps, is a little bit more complex. You need, from start to finish, you need the research, you need the innovation, and then you need different ways to support that research and innovation to sustain it, and ultimately for it to ideally stay in Canada or grow in Canada, and then support industry elsewhere. So the early stage innovation and research is very important, and it's actually a huge strength for Canada historically. And so that is something we've been supporting by creating these hubs. And earlier this year, the government provided funding for 19 projects that are being done through the various hubs. And we provided close to $500 million, which is a fair chunk of change for Canada to invest in this area of research. So that's a huge development, and that will hopefully grow talent from the academic side. Talent is also needed for manufacturing. You need specialized skill sets to do biomanufacturing, and for that we have established and supported CASTLE, which works with NIBRD, which is in Ireland. Ireland is the leading, focal point in the world who has developed a manufacturing curriculum and facility. And so we're relying on that expertise to provide that in Canada. And so they are tied and leading and working with NIBRD in Ireland to provide the same kind of curriculum development and research facilities throughout the country, again, to support and develop an ongoing manufacturing base. The last 2 points or pillars have to do with regulation, and clinical trials is a part of that. So that you can see is very key, because again, without that, we won't be able to produce and develop medications and research and innovate. And finally, the governance. And the reason why I want to mention this is, unlike other countries, we have from the get-go had an approach where the industrial portfolio and the health portfolio worked hand in hand to make these kinds of decisions, whether they be investment decisions or policy decisions around health security. Specifically the pandemic, but now we're moving to a more broader approach. And that is unique. Many of our allies and partners have focused it entirely on health, which makes sense for them. But we felt it was very important, because of where we are in our industrial development, that the two go hand in hand. So both ministers and both departments and their broader ecosystems have been involved together. So that brings me to today. And most recently, we have launched what we're calling Health Emergency Readiness Canada. And this was a desire to have a institutionalized, long-term focal point in the Government of Canada that would focus on health security and being ready and responsive for health security. So what is it, and what does it mean kind of moving forward? So from a very structural, bureaucratic standpoint, it's a special operating agency which resides within the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. So from the outside perspective, nothing really changes. It's still public servants reporting up through our usual infrastructure, and the Minister of Industry is ultimately responsible. But what is different is that the Minister of Health ultimately sets the priorities for some of the investment decisions. So the Health Minister needs to provide the threats and risks that are preoccupying the department from a health perspective, so that our investments moving forward align better in terms of what we need. The Health Minister also has a role in times of crisis to direct resources as needed. So that's a change, because we didn't have that structure set up, or that relationship set up and formalized. The other aspects, and the reason why it's a special operating agency is really more technical, but it does allow, from a public service standpoint, some flexibilities to hire technical experts who can help identify some of the investments we'll need to make from an academic or industrial standpoint. And it could also help in making sure that the funds allocated remain sort of preserved, especially when you're dealing with crisis management or in times of an emergency. In terms of the mandate, it very much continues to evolve from where the biomanufacturing life sciences strategy started. And the strategy has a twofold mandate, which is grow the sector and prepare for a crisis. And that continues. I think the only thing that really evolves is our definition of what a health emergency would be. I think initially in a pandemic, we're very focused on, pandemic, infectious disease, which still remains a priority. But this is now moving to a much broader definition of health security, including chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. It's linking it more to national security interests and looking at it from a North American security standpoint as well. But growing the sector still remains very important, because our sector is relatively young if you look at other places around the world and how deep and entrenched they are. So if you were to take a place like Ireland or the US, who've been at this for decades, who have industry abound, it's very easy to then come in and just say, from a government standpoint, I'm only going to focus on X, because the rest of the things are working on their own. We're not there yet. It will take us a while to get there. And that's why there was very much desire to have some focus that will maintain and support the enormous investments the government has made in a fairly short period of time. Because if you don't maintain and nurture them, they will go away and things will go back to where it was, which is not healthy. But also find ways to innovate. Because that innovation is what hopefully will save us the next time. Because the reality for Canada is while we are physically a very large country, which gives us certain amounts of complexity, we are a very small economy relative to the rest of the world. So we have to figure out what our strengths are and be able to trade on them. And I'll say parts of the clinical trial infrastructure are our strengths. And Mary alluded to, the diversity of our population. It's a huge draw, and it's a huge need to be able to test and try things out on a huge, diverse population base. That's a huge strength for us. Our research capacity and our innovation capacity and our scientific capacity is also enormous and very well renowned and respected. So those are things we need to build on. And even from an industrial standpoint, there are things we do that provide benefits, and we need to continue to work on. But the point is, we cannot do this alone. We need to have allies. We need to work with other governments, other non-government actors, other international organizations to make this a truly vibrant ecosystem. So the point is to prepare. So there are two other things I'll mention in terms of the new entity that are different. One is we're currently in the process of developing a program that would be focused on the life sciences and biomanufacturing ecosystem, really trying to find ways to support innovation in Canada and sustain it in Canada. That has always been our challenge. We often innovate, but we don't have the capital compared to some of our other countries to sustain it here, which is a challenge for us. And that's something we need to figure out ways to address. But we also want to bridge that ecosystem. So we create wonderful innovation, but the challenge to commercialize also becomes an issue. So how do we, from a public policy standpoint, support that? The other aspect, which is unique for government, is if you look at the two government assets that I've mentioned, or any of the other investments, the challenge is how do you stay ready, and how do you function viably when there is no crisis, versus how do you manage when there is a crisis. So some things, like the Biologic Manufacturing Center, needs to be, it's a not-for-profit entity, by the way. It was initially supported by government, but now runs as a not-for-profit entity. Needs to find a viable business model to sustain itself in these, in the in-between times. But the government does have the ability, we've never exercised it, we don't quite know how it'll all work, but in a time of crisis, to use that facility if we needed to fill and finish vaccines on an urgent basis. So how do you balance those things? The other aspect from an industrial standpoint that is unique for governments is how do you, or when do you invest in whether it's a countermeasure, it could be a diagnostic, whatever the case may be, that makes sense from a public health standpoint, but may have no commercial value. So those are interesting issues that we have to grapple with. And in those cases, we have to test and go through a regulatory process to ensure that these items are useful. But again, those are sort of the ongoing issues that, from a government standpoint, and that what this entity would need to look at. And the other, I think, evolving sort of policy challenges around supply chains. So we saw during the last pandemic, there were a lot of challenges through supply chains, but we knew what the problem was. We may not know what the problem is in advance, and so how do you test and remain prepared from an entire ecosystem perspective to manage supply chain disruptions, and how do you figure out those relationships and have those agreements in place in advance with other countries or other entities to prevent things from getting worse. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, some of the things this new entity will need to do. And I think I've highlighted and flagged some of the areas which link back to clinical trials and clinical trial research. So we're hoping that some of these investments are going to attract more innovation and business to Canada, thereby, again, trying to continue the work on clinical trials, even though we know there are some challenges. And also from the innovation side, from the research and development side, again, we're putting a lot more emphasis and support in that vein. So I'll leave it there, and I know there might be a few questions, so I'm happy to take those.
Up to the microphone now.
I'll get it started, because I know everybody's shy. Is this on? Okay. So, thank you for that excellent presentation. And I guess we're all really excited about to see these big investments, and hopefully they'll continue. I think one of the questions that's on many people's minds is when we see some of these young companies starting in Canada, how do we keep them here? How can we sustain that investment in the biomanufacturing or early research, and as they develop, ensure that Canadians benefit from that investment later on, rather than see them go with a VC to the United States or elsewhere? How can we do that?
So a number of issues. So what we're hoping to do by having a more dedicated fund that is focused on more of the earlier stage, I don't want to say the complete early stage because there are some government programming through IRAP at the NRC that does support that. But what we're trying to do is support the companies that are a little bit vulnerable and also support research. So just to back up, the money we've provided to the hubs, to the academic hubs and for their specific projects was tied. So it was a little bit different than the usual grant model. It was a grant, so the money did go out all at once. But we did make sure that it had to fit within our mission objectives and that the academic researchers had to work with industry partners. So oftentimes you can have great research, but you don't necessarily know how to translate it to commercialization. And there are a lot of entities in Canada who are trying to do that. They're kind of sitting in the academic space, they're also sitting in the industry space, and they're trying to do that. But traditionally, a lot of our funding programs, or the ones we had anyway during the pandemic, were very limited because it either won't support early stage research or it won't support entities that are kind of bleeding in these valleys. So what we're trying to do with this new fund, which I recognize is not launched yet, we're in the design phase, but we're trying to get that up and running, would be to bridge that gap and really to focus on that translational piece by providing additional supports. And we have looked a lot at BARDA, which is our counterpart in the US, in terms of, how do they structure their agreements, which is a little bit different than the current government models, and how do they work with industry along the way to keep them moving. Some of the challenges from a public policy perspective is these are public funds. Oftentimes research, especially in life science, is fickle. It may work, it may not work, so there's risk attached. So we have to make sure we're able to explain failure really well to the public, which isn't always fun, but you have to figure out some ways to manage that failure, because through that failure we do get success, and sometimes that success is enormous. And Canada has been blessed with a lot of that success, and that was evident in the last pandemic, but in previous pandemics as well. So those are some of the things that we have to think through, but that's what we're trying to do in the new program design. And you're absolutely right, we don't have the venture capital push that some of our allies do. But I think it's time to have a discussion at the pension fund stage to say, why aren't Canadian pension funds investing more in Canada, where the rate of returns are no different, but the scale is a lot smaller. So those are some policy issues that are top of mind and will, I think, shape our program design.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for the presentation and wonderful words. So you mentioned BARDA, and I'm from the US, and I'm kind of a little bit familiar with their work, so I was kind of curious. One of the things that BARDA is trying to do is they're also trying to reduce the time it takes to run a study, right? They have a call to funding right now to figure out how to run a study within 100 days, right? Because when a new pandemic hits, right?
Yeah.
And one of the major focuses of that is around decentralized trials. So I'm wondering if, what your strategy is going to be around decentralized trials, and also how you're going to partner with industry, because a big part of the sustainability of these type of programs is they're looking for industry to be able to sustain whatever network they set up, so that when the pandemic happens, the government can benefit from it, but also industry can use it for other purposes. So thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know if we're quite there yet, and again, our system's a little bit different in terms of how BARDA works with the FDA is also quite unique. So those are things we'll be working through again with Health Canada to see how we can bring the regulator along with us. And our clinical trial infrastructure is also significantly different than the US. We have to have I think a lot more conversations with our provincial and territorial counterparts to manage and streamline that infrastructure. So from our end, we can support some of that. But again, we're on the industrial policy side. We will work very closely with Health Canada and others to see whether or not, and I know there's some studies actually going on to see how we can reduce some of the infrastructure overlap that currently exists amongst PTs to streamline that. So there's maybe perhaps one day there'll be at least maybe one point of access or limited points of access, not as many ethics boards or some kind of ability to have things recognized. So those are more the infrastructure side that are definitely top of mind.
Thank you for your presentation. Coming from a life science, biopharmaceutical background for 15 years, Ritu, it's interesting to see a government document with global biopharma and homegrown companies on there. And I posit, you could disagree, but I think COVID, reflective to clinical trials, COVID caught us off guard, and for 5 decades, Canada did not take this sector seriously. And it's refreshing to hear you say national security, national interest, national security. There could be a change of government. Is there a whole of government, in your opinion, recognition of the value of the life sciences sector as an economic lever, a security lever, and will it be in any positive briefing books for a change of government? So lots of this progress can continue, which filters down to the clinical trials domain and everything else across the life sciences sector. I know you can't answer, but can you vote for that?
Yeah, it's a little bit hard for me to answer, other than to say we're working incredibly diligently to get certain things in place now. And again, expanding the base. So traditionally, like I said before, during COVID, this was very much a health portfolio, industry portfolio collaboration. We have expanded this out to defense and others over time. That's in the works because we do see this intrinsically tied to national security. And then we're not alone. We did this by looking at how a number of other jurisdictions have treated this issue. So we've done our homework. And it makes eminent sense, especially in terms of where we are on the continent. And if we're able to support North America or South America, we will need to keep that in mind. I'm talking from an export standpoint. We will definitely need to keep that in mind. And yeah, beyond that, I can't say anything. The public servants will provide the best advice to whoever is the elected official.
Great presentation, great remarks. Thank you so much. And you stole my question, and with respect to the change in government. But along those lines, what is the time frame that you're looking at with respect to standing up HERC? Understanding that the possibility of change in government exists. That's my first question. The second is with respect to clinical trial infrastructure, and wouldn't it be wonderful to have a national clinical trial infrastructure so that in the case of a pandemic, we could do something like the UK did at the beginning of the pandemic, where we had the data infrastructure in place and we could rapidly deploy and execute. So I know really big questions. I personally think that this is something that's going to take 10, 15, perhaps even 20 years to do, but I'm really interested to hear about what your thoughts on that are, and also how do we bring along whatever government, whatever color of government that we get in the future with this vision.
Maybe I'll start with the last point, because the way I would explain this is very much about economic development, innovation, and Barry, you mentioned AI earlier. There's a lot of AI nexus to bio and life sciences, and AI is huge for Canada, and hopefully we want to keep it that way, and so is life sciences. I mean, this is where you have, if you're going to be crass, really high-paying jobs. It develops the economy, it sustains the economy, and that's what we want, right? That's what we want to move towards. So that's how I would sort of look at it, and it also supports long-term the healthcare system. Two of the things that are top of mind for, I think, anybody in the country right now. So when we're trying to talk about supporting the ecosystem and also supporting emergencies, if we have a crisis and our healthcare system doesn't function, we're not going to be able to respond to the crisis. It has to work, right? So I think being able to make sure that people understand factually how all those things are linked are going to be very important. So So that's how I would look at that. And then of course there's underlying all of that the national security interest, but I think more practically speaking, that's kind of the bottom line. Sorry, the second question was around clinical trials. I don't disagree. This is going to take, all of this is going to take a while. There's a lot of cultural shifts as well, both for industry, for academia, for not-for-profit, even for government. And even for us, like we working hand in hand with health, that's a shift for us. We've never done that, and we're also a pain to them. You know, having to sort of think about industrial policy in a lot of decision making. But I think it's a good shift, and I think it's a necessary shift if we're going to move forward. And again, we're a smaller country. We have limited resources. We're just going to have to do the best with what we have, and we can see in the short term the economic footprint globally is different. So we're going to have to make the best and collaborate a lot more. And I think that's where the vision needs to go. I can't give you any more specifics than that, but I do know there are a number of challenges on infrastructure, and those are some of the things we want to look at. But again, we're dealing with this at the federal level. We will have to work collaboratively with PTs because a lot of this rests with provinces and territories, and we need to support whatever efforts they want to make. And I'm sorry, I'm just blanking on the first part of the question.
It's about recognition at the federal level of how much time this is going to take and
Yes.
how much of a sustained effort
Yes,
to
and you
support
wanted
those
to know
companies.
PERC listed up. So, yeah, and that's why we wanted something institutionalized. That was so in budget 23, the government actually did signal that it wanted options for a sustainable model to deal with health emergencies. So this is a sustainable model. It is stood up. Like we exist within the department. The folks working in biomanufacturing life sciences are now part of PERC. So we have people. The idea is to have some folks from health portfolio embedded. So that's there. The part we're trying to finalize now is the program design. So that's what we're working on, and we'd like to finalize that as soon as possible. And then we will take a bit of time to pivot to a more operational program delivery entity. But if things are finalized, then we can take some time to do that, and then we do call outs and figure out what you need to prioritize and how to manage the money and how to get people to apply. So that process takes place later, but we need the authorities to actually develop, launch a program. So that's where we're at. So we're not 100% there. I'd say we're about 85% there.
Hi there. Thanks again for the presentation. So I represent the CRO and locally here in Montreal, and I just you touched on regulatory as one of your main points, and I was just wondering if you could sort of give us a high level of what you're thinking and where you want to go. And
It's one of the pillars of the strategy, but again, this is the part where it's Health Canada's lead. So I won't because again, I work more on the industrial policy side. I will let them lead and speak to some of those things in terms of what they're doing. But hopefully, we will build on some of the changes they made during the pandemic and be able to leverage that moving forward, because we see how fast technology is moving and how complicated it's becoming. And I think, Mary, you talked about some of those innovations, especially in precision medicine, in medical devices. So that's going to be top of mind. But again, it'll be up to the regulator to direct conversation.
I'll just add a comment that there is a session tomorrow on regulatory modernization with Adam Fleming. So we'll be speaking about that. Is there any final questions? Again, I want to reinforce that Ritu has graciously offered to be here for the day, so you'll each have a chance to personally connect with her. Thank you so much.